May 4th, 1945. The European theater of the greatest conflict the world had ever seen was breathing its last. Adolf Hitler had taken his own life just 4 days earlier in that Berlin bunker, and the thousand-year Reich he'd promised had crumbled into dust and ashes in just 12 years. Captain Jack Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, sat on top of his Sherman tank called Besotten Jenny, a cigar hanging from his lips, studying a map of the Austrian countryside. The 27-year-old from Norwich, New York, had led his boys through France, across the Rhine, and now deep into the Austrian Tyrol. His division, the Hellcats as they were known, had earned a fierce reputation. The Germans themselves called them the Suicide Division for their tenacity in battle. Lee figured his fighting days were over. The war was won, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. Germany would surrender any day now. He looked at the mountains rising in the distance, thinking maybe, just maybe, he'd make it home to tell his grandkids about all this one day. Then something happened that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. A German officer drove up to his position, waving a white flag. But this wasn't a surrender. Not exactly. This German major had a story that would lead to the strangest battle of the entire war. A battle where Americans, Germans, and French prisoners would stand shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy in the last desperate gasp of Nazi fanaticism. The date was May 4th, 1945, and nobody who lived through the next 24 hours would ever forget it. High in the Austrian Alps, overlooking the village of Itter, stood a castle that looked like something from a fairy tale. Built in the 1800s on medieval foundations, Castle Itter had been a hotel, a private residence, and now, in 1943, Heinrich Himmler himself had seized it for a very special purpose. This wasn't going to be a death camp like Dachau, though it was administered by Dachau. No, Castle Itter was reserved for what the Nazis considered their most valuable French prisoners. Politicians, generals, men who had shaped France before the war, men who might be useful as bargaining chips or hostages. Picture this: former French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, the man who'd signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler, now imprisoned by the very man he'd tried to appease. Paul Reynaud, another former prime minister who'd tried desperately to save France in 1940. Two of France's top military commanders, General Maurice Gamelin and General Maxime Weygand, men who'd led French forces at the start of the war. And here's the twist that tells you everything about how the French felt about each other during those dark years. These men despised one another. Reynaud and Daladier were bitter political rivals. Weygand had surrendered to the Germans and served in the collaborationist Vichy government, which made the others hate him. They even ate at separate tables in the castle's dining room, unable to stomach breaking bread together. Oh, and there was one more prisoner who'd become crucial to our story: Jean Borotra, the bounding Basque, one of the greatest tennis champions France had ever produced. At 46 years old, he still had the athletic ability that had made him famous, and he'd need every bit of it before this was over. These proud, stubborn Frenchmen had one thing in common, though. They all knew what was coming. The SL, Hitler's true believers, were still out there in those mountains, and fanatics are most dangerous when they've got nothing left to lose. On May 2nd, something happened that chilled the blood of everyone in Castle Itter. Eduard Weiter, the former commandant of Dachau who'd fled to the castle, was found dead. 2 bullets. Some said suicide. Others whispered murder. Either way, it was a sign that the SS was unraveling, and when desperate men have guns, innocent people die. The castle's commandant, Sebastian Wimmer, took one look at Weiter's body and made a decision. He fled, abandoning his post, leaving the French prisoners alone in that castle with nothing but the weapons the guards had left behind. Free, technically, but trapped all the same, because the woods around that castle were crawling with SS troops who'd been given orders that made the Frenchmen's blood run cold. Kill anyone who looked like they might surrender. Shoot any man whose house displayed a white flag. The prisoners knew they had to get help, and fast. They sent out 2 men. First went Zvonimir Chuchkovich, a Yugoslav handyman, who somehow made it 40 miles to Innsbruck and found American troops. But the Americans he found were from a different division, outside their jurisdiction, and the response was tangled in red tape. So the castle cook, Andreas Krobot, jumped on a bicycle, and pedaled toward the nearby town of Virgil. What he found there nearly made his heart stop. The streets were full of SS men in their black coats, and he overheard them talking. They were planning to march on Castle Itter and slaughter everyone inside. Just when Krobot thought he'd be spotted and shot, a hand grabbed him and pulled him into a doorway. The hand belonged to a German officer, Major Joseph Gangl. Now here's where our story gets interesting. Joseph Gangl was no Nazi. This 34-year-old German major had fought on the Eastern Front, survived Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, and he'd seen things that had sickened him to his core. Secretly, he'd been helping the Austrian resistance, giving them information and weapons. He'd made a promise to his men. He'd get them through this war alive, and he'd do it by doing the right thing, even if that meant turning against everything he'd been taught to believe. When Krobot told him about the French prisoners and the SS death squad on its way, Gangl knew he had one chance to do something good in this terrible war. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed the Americans. Picture Captain Jack Lee's face when he saw it. A German major in full Wehrmacht uniform driving up to his tank position, white flag waving, but not to surrender. This German wanted to fight alongside them. "There are French VIPs in a castle," Gangl told Lee in English, "and the SS is going to kill them all." Lee didn't hesitate, not for a second. This was what he'd been fighting for, wasn't it? Saving lives, stopping the madness. He grabbed what he could: his own Sherman tank, Besauten Jenny, Lieutenant Harry Bass's tank, Boche Buster, and a handful of men from the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, soldiers who happened to be Black Americans serving in one of only 2 armored divisions that had integrated African American troops. Now get this picture in your head. American and German soldiers riding together in the same convoy. Lee and Gangl sitting side by side in a German Kubelwagen. Black American infantrymen riding on the outside of Sherman tanks alongside German Wehrmacht troops in a truck. This was happening just days after Hitler's death, while Germany was still technically at war with America. They raced toward Castle Itter, but the SS had been busy. They'd rigged a bridge with explosives, ready to blow it once they'd crossed. Gangl's men disabled the bombs while Lee made a tactical decision. He left Lieutenant Bass and Boche Buster behind to guard their escape route, then pushed forward with just 14 American soldiers, 10 German artillerymen, and 1 tank. 6 kilometers from the castle, they ran into an SS roadblock. The combined American-German force opened fire and scattered them. Then they rolled up to Castle Itter just as evening was falling on May 4th. The French prisoners couldn't believe their eyes. 1 tank, 7 Americans, and Germans. This was their rescue force. But it was all they had, and it would have to be enough. Captain Lee walked through Castle Itter, his experienced eye taking in every detail. The castle sat on a hill, stone walls, open field of fire in front. Defensible, if they were smart about it. He positioned Besauten Jenny, his Sherman tank, right at the main gate where it could command the road. His gunner, Corporal Edward Shimsick, a quiet kid from New York but one heck of a shot, started calculating ranges. Then something unexpected happened. An SS officer appeared, Kurt Siegfried Schrader. But this wasn't just any SS man. Schrader had been wounded fighting in Russia and sent to recuperate near the castle. The French prisoners had gotten to know him, and he'd seen things at Dachau that had turned his stomach, changed his heart. When the prisoners asked him to help organize their defense, he said yes, even brought his family into the castle for protection. So now you had American tankers, German Wehrmacht soldiers, a former SS officer, Austrian resistance fighters, and elderly French politicians, all preparing to defend this castle together. The French, despite Lee's orders to take cover, grabbed rifles and submachine guns from the abandoned armory. These old men, some in their 70s, weren't about to hide while others fought for their lives. All through the night of May 4th, they waited. SS reconnaissance teams probed their defenses, testing, watching. Major Gangl managed to get a call through to the resistance leader in Virgil, pleading for reinforcements. Only 2 more German soldiers and a teenage Austrian resistance fighter could be spared. They drove through the darkness to join the defenders. As dawn broke on May 5, 1945, the defenders of Castle Itter were as ready as they'd ever be. 1 American tank, about 24 soldiers, half American, half German. a handful of French politicians with more courage than combat experience. Facing them, somewhere between 100 and 150 Waffen SS troops, Hitler's elite, the fanatics who'd rather die than accept defeat. The battle was about to begin, and it would be like nothing anyone had ever seen. The morning of May 5th, 1945. The SS came out of the woods like wolves. Machine guns opened up. 20mm anti-aircraft rounds slammed into the castle walls with such force that bricks started crumbling. The castle shook. In one room, falling debris hit and injured Schreider's wife. From his position at the main gate, Besotten Jenny's guns roared back. The French prisoners, ignoring every order to take cover, fought from the windows. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, wielding a Tommy gun, later said, "I saw that the attackers could penetrate from the other side into the courtyard. I got my Tommy gun out of my trunk and went down to the courtyard, where I found some soldiers. Picture it. Men in their 60s and 70s, men who'd commanded armies and run governments, now firing rifles alongside kids from New York and farm boys from Bavaria, all of them fighting for their lives." Then disaster struck. An 88mm anti-tank gun, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal, zeroed in on Lee's Sherman. The shell hit Besotten Jenny dead center. The only man inside, a radio man trying to fix the faulty radio, barely escaped before the gas tanks exploded and the tank became an inferno. Their biggest gun, their shield, was gone. The SS charged the main gate. Major Gangl was everywhere, directing fire, rallying the defenders. When he saw former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud exposed near a window, he moved to pull him to safety. A sniper's bullet found Major Joseph Gangl. The German officer who'd risked everything to do the right thing fell, mortally wounded. He was 35 years old. In his last moments, he'd been protecting a Frenchman, an enemy from 2 wars, because it was the right thing to do. The defenders were running out of ammunition. The SS was closing in. Lee knew they needed help, and they needed it now. But how? The phone was dead. They were surrounded. That's when Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, made an offer. At 46, he was younger and faster than most of the other Frenchmen. "I can make it," he told Lee. "I'll vault the wall and run for help." It was suicide. The SS had strong points set up, ambush positions everywhere. But what choice did they have? Lee said yes. Jean Borotra, the man they'd called the Bounding Basque, the tennis player who'd thrilled crowds at Wimbledon and the French Open, took a deep breath. Then he vaulted the castle wall and ran. He ran like he'd never run before, dodging through SS positions, using every bit of the athletic ability that had made him famous. Somehow, miraculously, he made it through. He found the American 142nd Infantry Regiment and gave them the critical information about enemy positions and the desperate situation at the castle. Back at Castle Itter, the defenders were firing their last rounds. Lee had ordered everyone to fall back to the keep, the strongest part of the castle. They were down to maybe minutes before the SS would overrun them. The elderly French politicians had long since stopped arguing with each other. When death looks you in the eye, old grudges don't seem so important anymore. They loaded their last magazines, checked their sights, and prepared to sell their lives dearly. Then they heard it, the sound of engines. The 142nd Infantry Regiment came roaring down that road, Borotra himself riding with them in an American uniform. They slammed into the SS positions with overwhelming force. The SEs, caught between the castle defenders and fresh American troops, broke. Some tried to fight. Some tried to run. By 4 p.m., it was over. About 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest scattered into the mountains. The battle for Castle Itter, the strangest battle of World War II, was won. And the cost? On the Allied side, just one man. Major Joseph Gangl, the German officer who'd found his conscience at the end of a terrible war. 2 days later, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Captain Jack Lee was promoted and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He'd go home to Norwich, New York, and live until 1973, carrying with him the memory of that impossible day. The French prisoners were evacuated safely to Paris on May 10th. Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, the political enemies who'd fought side by side, would both return to French politics. The policies they shaped would carry France into the 21st century. Jean Borotra, the tennis star, lived to be 95, always proud of that desperate run he'd made through enemy lines. And Major Joseph Gangl. The people of Virgil, Austria, made sure his sacrifice was never forgotten. They named a street after him. They erected a monument. He's remembered as a national hero, an Austrian patriot who proved that even in the darkest hours of the darkest war, one person doing the right thing could change everything. The Battle of Castellitter remains unique in military history. It was the only time in World War II when Americans and Germans fought side by side as allies. It proved that common humanity could triumph over ideology, that courage isn't about which uniform you wear, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for what's right. Those of us who remember those years, or who heard the stories from fathers and grandfathers who were there, we understand something that maybe gets lost today. War brings out the worst in people, but sometimes, just sometimes, it brings out the best too. May 5th, 1945, Castellitter, Austria. The day enemies became brothers. The day old men found young courage. The day one German major proved that honor and conscience matter more than orders. They don't make stories like that anymore. Maybe because we don't have to. Maybe because the lessons of Castellitter, the lessons those men bought with their courage and Gangl bought with his life, have shown us a better way. We can only hope so.